Hello and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast for today. It's going to be November 3rd, Election Day 2020, but I'm recording this much earlier than that because I've got other things to do on Election Day. This is episode 57, and I'm here with the Uberboyo himself. You can follow him on Twitter at Uberboyo, and you can follow him on YouTube. His channel is fantastic. There'll be links to all of this in the show notes, so please do go check it out if you want a great, challenging YouTube channel on what's going on in culture as it pertains to philosophy. I think this is one of the premier channels on YouTube today. And we're going to talk about something a little off topic for this podcast. But it's absolutely undergirds all of the things that I talk about on a regular basis, all the political analysis and everything else. We're going to do some deep dive on where philosophy and economics meet and explode and hopefully find some form of resolution. So that's what we're going to do today. A little bit off the beaten path, and then we'll see where the conversation goes. So good morning, Uberboyo. How are you, sir?
I'm good, sir. I'm good. Sadly, over here in Ireland, we're having the end of our day. The sun has sank down into the underworld, and it's currently dark right now. But I'm glad that you were rising to a new dawn. It's an exciting week, and you said that this is going to be released on the election day. So I'm hyped as hell to be talking to you Americans on election day. I hope I said there'll be fire in your bellies on that day. Let's put it that way. That's going to be wild, I say.
It is, and just so you know, I do have a fairly international audience. It's small, but I have a lot of friends in Britain. I have a lot of friends, interestingly enough, in Serbs and Russians and everything, because I talk about all of that geopolitics all the time. So this should be a good expansion of or crossover for our audiences, because this would not normally be something that should cross over, but actually there's a lot of common ground. So
awesome.
So it was funny, my wife is a huge fan of yours, and I listen to you guys all the time, like popping around the house, and I come downstairs, get a cup of coffee, and you guys are on in the background, and you're doing your thing, and you're having your streams are fantastic and they're fascinating, and most of what my wife listens to on YouTube is fascinating, because she has an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, and it's crazy how good she is, better than me, and but you guys were doing, you were having a stream with somebody. I don't know who it was, but we were talking about Nietzsche and the will to power and all this stuff. And I heard some economics stuff come out of, come out in the conversation. And I'm like, and it all rang wrong. And realize, don't feel bad. I feel that way about 99% of the people who talk economics, because most of them get it wrong. Most of them, unfortunately, are paid, to willfully get it wrong. I said that would be a really interesting conversation to kind of blend what you do and what I do, and to see where we can find common ground to kind of bridge the communicative divide is basically what I'm looking at here. So.
Awesome. So, well, I know where I'd like to dive in from there. So I'm going to go in a bit of a tirade. So stop me at any point if you want to call me out for using silly words.
The floor is yours. Go ahead.
Awesome. Well, listening to Nietzsche, and a lot of what I talk about on my channel is, of course, psychology, Carl Gustav Jung, and Nietzsche and whatnot. And it's all centered around some very, very interesting and crazy theories. But one of the key ones is about the nature of human productivity. And the way that we would understand that in our parlance, the way that this is well marketed to people, is creativity. You know that thing? It's like, I want to be a creative person. And creativity is it's one of those things that is seen as universally good. You can't run around and be like, we need less creativity around here, and maybe on an economics podcast that might be something slightly different, but in general speak, in the corporate world, they're like, that's a pretty big deal. In general society, that's a pretty big deal, and we have this implicit instinctive understanding that creativity is this golden power. It's probably the closest thing we could connect to what we understand as the human spirit. It's this shining light of imagination, this ability to dream, this ability to think differently. It's why we revere people like, Einstein or great musicians or Leonardo da Vinci and all this. And this is all quite a fascinating thing, because the source of creativity within the human mind becomes a very, very, very important thing, I believe, when you're talking about what value is, because creativity is probably one of the prime sources of value. Now, I'm not going to say it's the only source of value, that would be silly, but it is one of the absolute prime sources of value. Now, from studying people like Nietzsche and Jung and all them, you can constantly come up with these guys trying to wrestle with the problem is that why are the vast majority of people not that creative? And why are the creative people so they find it so hard to be creative? Why do we like obsessively procrastinate? Why are we so intrepid, desperately bad at doing things? And then, like, for example, you'll have people who are immensely creative and they might be tortured by demons or something like that. Why is creativity tied strangely to experiences like madness? Nietzsche himself was someone who went insane at the end of his life. Jung himself had a psychotic break and he wrote it down as his red book. And this is all a very, very fascinating thing. It seems like the part of us that is most creative and we would say the fountain of our creative spirit seems to be tied to something that is unstable and profound, and dare I say even tied to what we would understand as the religious experiences of our life. Now, all of this, I think, becomes quite relevant. Well, I'm going to try baby step this towards the economics question. But before I even get there, I would like to go to, for example, Nietzsche's idea of the will to power. Basically, a lot of these Germans around about this time, Freud, Jung was Swiss, Nietzsche, they were all, and even people like Marx and all that, they were all trying to figure out what's the essence of man, what is the nature of the human being. And we see right now that we're probably going to go through a bit of a transition about what the nature of the human being is in our age, but back then they were trying to figure it out for their age. And their attempt was to try to dig it down to like a core essence, like what is it that makes a human being work? And what you got with someone like Darwin, Charles Darwin, for example, an Englishman, as he proposes, it's the will to survive, the desire to survive. What is the thing that makes you different, I guess, than a rock? Is that you will fight people in order to eat and all this type of stuff. And this forms a sort of basis for our nature, the nature of life, if you will. The nature of life is to struggle forward, is to try and make it on. And maybe even in Darwin's kind of framing, a very British attitude, if I don't say so myself, is that it's to cling like yeast to the rock and merely survive. That is the sort of nature of life. And you see this quite a lot in the sort of scientific thinking of modern days, is that like life was not some thing that willed itself into existence in this magical way. It was more like a lucky accident because we are sort of, yeast clinging to the rock, flinging around the solar system, and we're just sort of a happy accident if we don't say so ourselves. Now, that's a very, 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 very interesting first principle. And we're going to definitely come back to that a lot. And we're definitely going to talk about that more because that has massive connotations for the way that we run our society nowadays. That's what we actually believe, I believe. But the juxtaposition, the opposite direction that I would suggest came from people like Nietzsche, and then as a derivative, people like Freud and Jung. And I'm going to actually talk to all of these if you don't mind.
Sure.
So we'll get to it one by one, but Nietzsche, I guess, will start because he came first. And Nietzsche proposed something different. He got disgusted by this idea that life was merely yeast clinging to a rock. And he saw when the Prussians fought against the French, he saw this Prussian army. This was about 40 years before World War I. This Prussian army marched through towards to fight the French and claim, Germany as a nation is when it became what it became. And he saw them all dressed up in their like elaborate armor. And back then, like, the armor was big swinging dicks and they were all like, big hardcore badasses and all this type of stuff. Right. And he was like, this is beyond mere life. This isn't yeast. These men are going to charge into battle and die. They're gonna die looking good. They're gonna die risking their lives. They're gonna die for something crazy and chaotic. You could think of it almost like Leonidas in 300. Yep. And these guys could have had the opportunity. They were like aristocrats. They could have sat at home and had concubines and munched on crumpets or whatever they did back in Prussia back in the day. Right. And the same with Leonidas. He could have just chowed down with Xerxes in the thing, but instead he went for something else. And so in his essence, Nietzsche started to believe that the nature of man, the will inside man, was higher than just mere yeast. It wasn't just clinging to rocks. It was something that tries to leap off rocks. Life itself, its essence, was to strive upwards, to be something greater. And he began to propose that was the essential problem problem that we are running into in the 20th century, is that we have collectively chosen to believe that humans are merely decrepit pieces of yeast, and life is something that we have to preserve delicately at all costs. And I'm sure if you look around your world right now, you'll kind of see the dangers of that type of thinking.
It's called Marxism. It's terrible.
Well, it comes in many forms.
No, I know it does. It's collectivism is what it comes. In my terms, I see it purely in terms of the individual versus the collective. And even though we know so much more about brain, the physicality of the brain and mirror neurons and all these things about how we aren't rugged men on an island by ourselves, we aren't. But at the same time, we are, right? We have to be individuals within that respect and get feedback off of all the other people around us. We are made better by being individuals all near each other, doing things and working off of each other. And I interestingly enough, I now agree with Nietzsche. No, we absolutely aren't yeast clinging to rocks. So go ahead.
Yes, 100%. And then Nietzsche was I think libertarians should definitely read Nietzsche. He's actually a bit of a frightening individualist. Like he is to the point where he's like, he goes to some extremes where you're kind of like, Jesus, dude, like calm down.
Well, I do live by the adage. I don't talk about it all very often, but you have the will to, you have the right to die, and pretty much everything else is your own struggle. That's the way I live my life. That's the way I view all of this stuff. And because that keeps you as humble as possible against the universe. Because remember, I'm also trained as a chemist and as a physicist, and I really do understand the 3 laws of thermodynamics. And they are that you can't win, you can't break even, and you're not allowed to leave the game. Okay, so yeah, when you live in that world, dude, and you truly understand the philosophical implications of the Gibbs free energy equation, and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, all of a sudden, like, I have to work that much harder to survive in a universe that's actively hostile to me and my existence. And you have to decide, and you have to find it within yourself whether or not you're going to survive in that. So I agree with Nietzsche completely. Go for it.
Ladies and gentlemen, if this is on election day, I hope you remember that mantra later, depending on the outcome. Like, just keep repeating that in your mind.
Nice point.
All right. I'll keep tearing into Nietzsche. We'll take the fingers off the pressure on making people have freakouts. They're just on their morning coffee or something like that.
It's fine. This is what people are. This is what people expect. This is great. Fantastic. Keep going.
Okay. So again, to dive just a bit more into Nietzsche's theory based on that idea, because Nietzsche has a lot of very, very interesting premises. And as I said, we will get to the economic side of it. For example, one of his propositions is to reevaluate all values. And of course, value is that shining word you must focus on when he talks. He also talks about the idea of morality as being fundamentally tied to value. What is good is related to the idea is what is valuable. Now, before we get to that, I want to begin at this idea, though, of the conception of mankind as a yeast clinging to a rock, and how that begins to evolve and move us forward into the current century and our perception of the current century. And it's the century of, as Tom brought up, the mass man. If you've ever watched a lovely documentary on YouTube known as The Century of the Self, you see them talk about Edward Bernays, the mad capitalist, the laissez-faire style free market capitalist dude who sees the mob of free market capitalism as something he can exploit and use it to malicious aims in order to persuade people to do things that would be like, you could only describe them as kind of like not very benevolent towards the flourishing of the human spirit. He persuades people to smoke. He persuades governments to put fluoride into the water. Whatever you think of that, it's still interesting. You have to persuade them. He persuades doctors for certain things. He does all sorts of strange things that definitely would make you scratch your noggin and think to yourself, right, this dude isn't exactly the good thing. And tied underneath his mindset, I find his mindset fascinating. I also find it fascinating he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, but his mindset is fascinating because it kind of revolves around that idea of that, like, what mass man is a sort of pebble in this ocean of people that you can sort of manipulate and use and twist for profit, and it's a sort of a fair game. And there's no conception of higher goals, apart from the fact that like the higher goal is for you to just rinse cash out of them completely. And that's the sort of idea behind it. And what this goes on to do is that a lot of people end up like participating in this at the early 20th century, and they form in America the famous character of the Americans that people insult them throughout the world, which I think is unfair. I think they tend to be a lot smarter than they're given credit for. But, you know, the idea of the kind of like in one hand, there's like an AK and maybe like, I don't know, an M14 or something like that. And the other hand, there's like a burger. And then they're like, you know, running around watching a football game or something like that. And they're just the perfect consumer. And they're actually known to be like that all around the world. Like they're the perfect consumer. And Americans are very like trigger happy with their money and whatnot. And this is the sort of conception of the person who's just living for consumption, the yeast form of life. I know this is so insulting to the Americans. I'm actually not trying to insult you. I like you guys quite a lot, but this is just sort of where some of this stuff goes.
No, you're right, and don't get me wrong. I see where that image comes from. This is where the problem is. The fundamental problem is I see this. I'm like, I know exactly where this comes from, and it comes from the very thing of being able to forcibly organize people away from core values and from first principles, and to corrupt them through, I will argue, a corrupt monetary system and a corrupt money system, which destroys their ability to perceive value.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Because money itself, remember always that this is very. Here's the introduction. Money is 1/2 of every transaction out there, right? So if you corrupt the value of the money, you corrupt the ability for people to figure out how much money should I give for that thing that I want. And when you can direct their purchases towards things that are not sustainable, well, with unsustainable and vast oceans of money, then you can corrupt them in every way, and you can change their time preferences. This is how we Austrians talk about it. We call it in terms of time preference. And low time preference behavior is something that allows you to, through time, if you're less anxious about today than you are about tomorrow. If you're less anxious today, you've got enough stuff for today, you can get through tomorrow. Well, then you can start planning for tomorrow. But if you are worried about tomorrow, and literally today, Tuesday, worried about tomorrow, then you engage in high time preference behavior. You engage in that in stuff that takes care of immediate needs now and everything else, and altering the structure of production through altering the value of money and the cost of money is everything that's wrong with our society today.
Yes.
It's a profound insight into the way the world works, is that a corrupt money begets a corrupt society. Yep. Because you corrupt people's ability to value their time, which is the only true scarce natural resource any of us have. So
yes, absolutely. I can't wait until we really get into this, because that's you've brought up some brilliant points there that I absolutely want to expand on. To continue with the story of the yeast, though, I'm bullying this yeast. I'm going to keep bullying this yeast because it's a bad buzz. This yeast mindset, this last man mindset, as Nietzsche called it, and he saw it as like what will happen. And it's so interesting how prophetic he was for 100 years before. Is basically the earth was almost on its last legs. Humanity was about to swell and like take over the earth like a bacterial infection, and it was going to start to swallow up the earth, and because this form of humanity, it was rising, the mass man, the yeast man, the man that clings to the rock and has no higher goal other than to just survive. And this was going to, chew up the environment. He's a bit of a leftist, maybe, if you think about it that way. He's going to chew up the environment. He was going to destroy culture. And most importantly of all, he would have no higher ambitions or goals. Why? Because that would risk him having to lose his clutch on the rock. He might have to jump off into space, and that might be a dangerous thing where he could lose his, 70 years of hedonism that he gets. And this is where you start to get a perceptive insight into the nature of this last man and why it's actually such a dangerous man, and strangely how it's so tied to the idea of the happy man, the person who just fills their belly and enjoys the kind of simple pleasures. And not that is necessarily bad, but you can understand if you make a religion out of that, you kind of get into a dangerous place, because all that life is then is just simply something where you stuff your face, you enjoy, you reap the harvest harvest of history for your generation, where you consume everything, you consume the earth, you have no culture, you have no higher ascendancy, everything becomes reduced and commodified. This is all of this is actually very interestingly leftist in a way. It's like everything gets commodified. It's the global homogenization of capitalism. The native cultures all around the world get a McDonald's shoved in their main street. Like here in Ireland, there's a load of beautiful old buildings that came from back when Ireland was in the 19th and 18th centuries. And you go into these buildings and there's like a fecking McDonald's or a Starbucks inside. Like that's what you find. And that's like the perfect symbol for what's happening. It's the ascendancy, the spreading of that sort of it's this unity of culture. It's the same way as like all music is now slowly starting to move towards the same set of chords and stuff like this.
And get me started.
Yes, and it's unbelievably depressing, and this is what's so depressing about it, is that it almost like matches the slow grinding quality of the second law of thermodynamics, the entropic quality of life. It feels like a civilization in decline, and what's happening there is it all just like molds together into just this one grayscale instead of having any diversity or color. Like it sounds so much like what I hear the left talking about.
Yeah,
there's no diversity.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Philip K. Dick and Duandre's New Electric Sheep, the book that was made into Blade Runner all these years ago, was the first kind of adult book I ever read, and he described the process of kibble, the world becoming kibble, and it was this whole entropic, and the whole book is about entropy and entropy, the entropy and empathy, right? The lack of empathy in a world being consumed by entropy,
Yeah.
And talk about a guy who went completely insane 50 years ahead of his time. What you're describing, and it's exactly that. And the world of Blade Runner is a brilliant dystopic vision of that. And then we can go even farther into Blade Runner 2049, which is even more horrific. But go ahead.
Yes, 100%. And I think that's the sort of the reason why like there's just so often these visions of radical dystopias. Like that's not actually that historically common. It is during times of dystopia. It's like the collective unconscious can sense it, but that stuff only really started to show up in the 20th century in a big way. Like Orwell is quite famous and stuff like this, and then obviously like so many of our movies were like Terminator, Blade Runner, all this type of stuff. A lot of recent films are very, very dark, and Mad Max as well, all that type of stuff. It's the churning up, the dissolving. That's the sort of end point of the set of trends that are active in our world right now. And I think the reason why this character, this last man, this consumer is so dangerous is because they are led by their belly, and the conception of the world is dictated. The entire system is built upon the vision of a man as a walking belly, as a belly that runs around and needs to be fed. That is literally like yeast into a rock. Something like hurting that person's feelings, or hurting that person, or imposing some type of restriction or order or demand in that person. That's the most shocking and rude thing you could ever imagine, because that's hurting the noble belly that deserves to be left alone. Instead, there's this utter deification of people's comfort. That's sort of what you get with this type of thing, and it leads to this drastically entropic thing. And it's a scary thing, because then you start to realize that this stuff is not abstract philosophy, but in fact the cravings of comfort within you juxtaposed with your higher visions is actually where this war is genuinely getting fought. And I guess that's a good segue into what Nietzsche noticed. Nietzsche famously like very, very rude in his books, often putting people down, calling the English philosophers cabbage heads and stuff like this, because he blames them for their conception of this. He felt, as he said, he saw that vision of bravery. Like that's a very interesting emotion when you think about it. Bravery, the willingness to risk your clutching to the rock and risk death and welcome death instead of living just as a mere piece of yeast or as a mere slave or something like that. And this is a higher version of humanity, something higher in man, the beyond human quality, the beyond animal quality within man. You could even say the divine within man. This is the part of man that lifted us out of the jungles and carried us into Rome and carried us into Western civilization and carried us into the great religions and churches of that litter the West and carried Islam up out of the floor and the Chinese states and Japan and everything. And this spirit is essential for us to understand, because this spirit, this higher part of ourselves, seems to be tied to almost every single thing we could understand as virtue. And creativity seems to be tied to this. To be creative requires risk and bravery. If you're going to present something new to the world, you're going to have to risk getting crucified. Jesus precisely is the good example. Like, he comes and creates the biggest and greatest religion of all time, and he gets fucking murdered by his boys. You know, they're just like, oh, shut up, bro. Get nailed up there. And any artist you talk to, a genuine artist who's tortured by his dreaming mind, will have to be outcasted at some point. He will have to kind of break away. A scientist who wants to change a paradigm is going to have to feel the blunt force of the previous paradigm. A soldier, a political activist, all these people are going to have to come up and confront with the slow entropic paradigm of before. And Nietzsche was proposing something that this is what we should dictate as the source of our values. And he noticed that if you built a worldview in these two separate emotions, you would get a radically different perspective on two of them. One, if you built a worldview on the emotion of courage and bravery and creativity, you would get what he would call a master morality. And then if you built the other one based on discomfort, you would get what we call a slave morality. Now, this is obviously very loaded terms, but you can think of it just in terms of how these two people would see good and bad. The weird, ambitious dude who eats, like, sweet potatoes and beef and never, ever, ever eats sugar and exercises at 3 a.m. every day and all this weird stuff. He's like ridiculously disciplined and kind of a bit of a boring dude to be around. And this ambitious dude is like preparing for some like really abstract fight he's doing in order to make himself free from, I don't know, the restrictions of the modern states and all this type of stuff. Most of the normal last men, comfort eating, comfort hanging out people would look at that dude as a weirdo, as an outsider, as a strange dude, as a bad dude. He lives a boring, bad life. Whereas with their pleasure, the amount of pleasure in their life dictates to them goodness. It's like, I have this Netflix, I have all these interesting new colorful foods, and they're all like so good and interesting and novel. They're also exciting, the way they fill me with joy. Whereas of course this other's his whole perception and worldview would be like completely opposite. He would see this colorful food as riddled with all these poisons from I don't know, silly Roundup or something like that, or whatever the coloring is. Like, it's just not healthy, it's not natural. He would see what these other people, these comfort-seeking last men eat as bad, as not necessarily evil, but just as like disgusting, as below him, as not tasteful. And you would see, ambition, striving, achievement, these things that are often pathologized by the comfort-seeking. He would see that stuff as great, as good, as the only thing that gives life a purpose and whatnot. And from here, you have a conflict in values, a conflict in value systems. You have a conflict in what people care about. That's what we mean by value. We have a conflict in what people think matters. And you're seeing this right now play out immediately in our world. You see this constant conflict between what matters. What matters in some sense is safety and comfort, and making sure people don't get hurt, and making sure bad things don't happen to people, and people don't get sad, or all these type of things. There's this obsession about protectionism and all these type of things. And the way I would describe it is not that these things are necessarily bad or evil. I'm not trying to demonize them, but they can't be the highest virtue, if you know what I mean.
No, they can't be.
That's the perception of what a mother understands. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what is the juxtaposition to that? What is the opposite perspective? And obviously, I think especially a lot of you libertarians, like, you would sort of lead with that idea of like, I would rather, like, freedom is worth more than your life. It's better to die than it is to live a slave type idea. Well, and
I think that's the first stage that a lot of us go through. I mean, for me, becoming a libertarian was like the day I figured it out. I'm like, oh, and then during that early process, I talk about this all the time. I wrote an article about this recently. I said, what's the difference? It's an old joke in libertarian circles. What's the difference between a minarchist and an anarchist? Well, 2 years. In that it takes about 2 years for you to let go of the comfort trappings of the state and embrace the fact that you're by yourself on this place. The non-aggression principle tells you that the state is anathema to you, and during that early surge of vitality, that throwing off the old yoke of the false dyad of conservatism versus liberalism, and see the world for where it truly is, which is authority versus liberty. That tends to just, okay, yeah, I'm ready to paint my face blue, put on a kilt, and go charge the English with an axe. It's really funny. I saw a meme. I only bring this up as a meme, like the conservatives in 2016 is like Mel Gibson in his prime, in like the year of living dangerously, and then conservatives today, Trump voters today, it's Braveheart. Right? Yeah. So that's where we kind of are, right? And that process, I've seen that so many times in watching people, embrace the idea of becoming an individual. And it's very empowering. It creates a tremendous amount of vitality. But then you start to have to integrate it into the whole of human experience. And my view on this today is much, much different than it was, say, when I was 35 or 36, when this first happened, or right around the turn of the century, about 20 years ago. So I'm 52. So around 32 or so, I'm like, yeah, no, okay. And I was like full of passionate intensity for 2 or 3 years. And then over the course of time, you come to realize it's just like everything else. It's another way to view the world and figure out your best path through it, because you can't control all these people out here. You have no control over them. And they're not even wrong. They're not you. And that's a fundamentally different. And then once you get into that mindset, then you're not willing to die for anything. You're willing to die for my daughter, my wife, and pretty much nothing else. And everybody, and that's where things go from there. So, but just to temper that. But the fundamental, you're absolutely right. But it becomes a much more nuanced thing as you get through it. So as you work your way through it.
Certainly, and I think obviously the conversation should certainly get tempered and nuanced as we progress through.
Sure.
But I think on principle, the thing that we notice we respond to as humans, as identifying with the human spirit, the essence of the hero is fundamentally tied to this idea of risking your life for something bigger than you. Absolutely. And it definitely gets complicated, because it's like, well, do you want to risk your life, for spreading McDonald's to the Middle East or something like this, or spreading
the hero cycle? The hero has to go through that moment where he faces his own death, and our stories are there to tell us metaphorically how we go through that process, right? And where to get the strength and the bravery that you're talking about. So that's what they're for. So
100%. And I would even suggest from a Jungian angle that we're pre-programmed with this energy. Absolutely. And it appears in us. And this is what I find interesting about it, is that it's like a sleeping giant. And I've noticed this in people. Like, I work with people as essentially as a psychologist, and you notice this in dudes, is that their minds have been they've been so comforted and placated throughout their whole life that and it's so weird what it does to them. They feel powerless because of it. They feel tepid and flaccid and weak because of how easy everything is and how soft everything is and how everything is sort of bureaucratic as opposed to assertive. You can't just take a risk and then have a conclusion. You have to go these long ways of like dotting your I's and your T's and all this stuff to kind of get anywhere in this world. And this destroys their souls. And sometimes you can sort of speak it out of them and get them to connect and get them to do stuff that is empowering, like and it awakens inside of them this, like, it's almost like a primal memory of what it meant to be human and meant to be, deciding for yourself, taking a risk, asserting, choosing, setting a vision, setting a goal, having your own plan, having your own desires. This is in some sense the main one. It's like you have your desires and everything is geared around you to say that, like, you can't achieve your dreams. You can't get that. I know it's turned into a bit of a self-help talk now, but
sure,
but this it's certainly what the world is sort of forming into. It's like there's this parody that you can't achieve your dreams, but then in practice, like, the people around you will be like, no, you can't do that. That's crazy. Don't try that. Hold back and shut your mouth. Lower your horizons. Don't raise your expectations. Lower your standards. If I was to put it laconically, that type of thing. And there's something about that is wrong on based on our nature, is what I'm saying. Absolutely. Our nature just does not believe that. And so I guess all of this comes down to, again, to try to get it back to economics the best I can. As much as this has to come, This
That's my
has
job.
this on some level has to come down to a decision about like what we are. So the system that has been built, and I'm not going to say we've built it because I think it was in place before we were born, but the system that has been built and we live under, it does not follow the dictate that there is something crazy and frenzied and profound about human nature that we could capture in some sense. Instead, it takes a far more conservative approach. Now, this is a pretty broad stroke because I think to an extent, like certainly capitalism, free market capitalism is probably the best we've got towards rewarding innovation and all that type of stuff. I don't want to deny that. But there are other perspectives that we could take that suggest this in a different way. And what I mean by this is that as we moved into the 20th century, like Nietzsche's idea was very, very prominent, but it never really took on. It never became the foundation for any generalized worldview of a lot of these people who are marketers. But Freud took this same idea, the core nature, the core will, the core energy, the thing that animates the human being. And Freud decided that it was this sexual urge. You've probably heard that famously. Right. Freud is the sexual dude. Right. Now, this actually became really prominent through Bernays in the way that our system works. Like the dictate of like the reason why you see women butt naked in advertising all the time, the reason why like the Muslims look at the West and be like it's literally the seat of Satan is because there's like naked chicks everywhere. Yeah. And this all comes sort of from the conclusions derived from by people like Bernays, who were building off Freud, that there's these massive unconscious primal animalistic urges, and they're almost like lions in a circus that you can spin hoops for and pull it through your various goals. So if you want to get someone to buy something, you just need to like, flash a load of naked chicks. You ever see those ads where it's just like a girl just holding a cigarette and she's like on the beach, and they just like they show that and they're like,
on the beach.
Strike. Yes, or even the one where just this guy gets out of an airplane and then he just lights a cigarette and then it's like, look, you strike, and you're like, what? Exactly. That doesn't make any sense at all. But it doesn't have to. It's about appealing to these type of things, status, these unconscious things, and this dictate has a premise about what man is. Man is a stomach, or even worse, man is a set of testicles, and that's the sort of thing that you should treat him as and appeal to him as. And of course, it's extremely profitable to do that. It is absolutely genius to do that. Mm-hmm. It will make you a lot of money to do that. It's not a stupid thing. Like, it's very, very smart. It's just that eventually, because it runs with that premise, that spiritual premise of what a man is, it actually slowly tips everything down towards entropy, as we said, till we get what we have nowadays, which is there's just like Instagram is just basically a brothel at this point. Yes. You've got OnlyFans is like this prominent thing going on, and it's all like maybe it's good if you're a handsome dude. It's great that everything's like this and whatnot, but in some sense this society doesn't seem like it has a time preference that's going to extend much longer than the next 10-15 years.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting the Bernays angle is really interesting, and what's also funny, and one of the things that we've done badly on the libertarian front, as I say this all the time, is that we market from the head to the heart as opposed to from the heart to the head, right? This is the first principles of advertising. Like, we talk about how things from a logic perspective. Well, it makes sense that this, and therefore we should all be libertarians. Like, no, it doesn't work that way. You have to get people in their gut. Like, and I think what's interesting about the Bernays thing is, as you were talking about that, the thing that kept popping into my head was Apple. Apple doesn't engage in that kind of advertising. It never has. It actually engages in an even more subtle and more aspirational form of advertising. Apple uses almost zero sex whatsoever, prurient, kind of base common denominator stuff. It does use the aspirational, we're going to make your life better. Right. An iPhone or whatever, it's think differently. Right. It's, if you look at Apple's advertising, Apple is incredibly good at finding the thing that's going to get you, that's going to make you want to be a better person. If you buy this thing, I can make you not only more productive, I can make you just more, I can inspire you to be great. That's Apple's advertising model. It has always been that way since when Jobs ran the company, and today it's still comes through the company's ethos in terms of its design, in terms of all of these things. It's not as good as it used to be. Okay, but we're talking about in terms of design, form equals function equal this, all of those things, that things had to be beautiful, right?
Yeah.
Because you're not just putting this ugly thing in your house. It has to be this beautiful object that you want to interact with on a regular basis. It's very important. It's why Apple's where they are. And they're doing so through they get support from various government agencies, but not in the same way that Microsoft did, for example. Microsoft took over the world as the board because Bill Gates was chosen, and Microsoft was chosen by the DoD and by the American government to become the de facto standard of how we of what computer operating systems and what network operating systems we were going to use, because Gates was willing to play ball at every level because he was chosen from the beginning, because he's a Malthusian eugenicist. Well, which fits in with the model of the mindset of the people that run this world. They're crazy. They're insane. And when you look at the world and you see it the way I see it, from my corner of the universe, it's all you can see. And then Apple was always the kind of the outsider, making things that were beautiful and making things that were that inspired you to be better. And eventually Microsoft ran into the brick wall of mismanagement, and Apple stood there and eventually said, no, we're gonna take the world forward. So Microsoft and Intel, for example, they owned the computing world because basically they had a massive built-in market that was created through the laundering of real value out of real people's pockets through taxation into the American government, and then shoved back into the economy. Right, and redistributed. Our personal profits were redistributed to them. Whereas Apple, eventually, Steve Jobs said, the future is not desktop computing. The future is not any of that stuff. The future is we're going to have Dick Tracy. We're going to have watches in our arms that have video screens on them, and we're going to have supercomputers in our hands in the Library of Alexandria at our fingertips. That's what we're going to do. And everybody in the company told him he was nuts. And he said, do it anyway. I don't care. Like, literally, talk about a guy who embodied will at that level,
certainly.
Right? I mean, just willed things into existence that had no business existing. Toyota, old man Toyota, did this with manufacturing for cars, Kanban, and the Toyota production system. Go look at the Toyota production system as an object lesson in how to not just optimize the production of any particular widget, but how you optimize through the maximization of effectiveness and purpose of the people doing it, so that they take immense pride in their work. And by doing that, they made the world a better place because they infected supply chains all around the world. They made GMs better. They made Fords better because all the same companies that were working for Toyota were plating, bolt heads and piston rings and all the rest of it. Those plating shops all had to be brought up to Toyota standards. They all used Ford and GM as clients too. Right? So Jobs did the same thing in the computing industry. He forced through innovation the entire world to be better. And that is exactly what you're talking about. And that's the essence of free market capitalism at its core. It is service, not profit. Gary North, the great Austrian economist and libertarian, also a Calvinist, by the way, interestingly enough, always talked about free market. The free market was about serving your customer. It's about service and submission to whatever the customer needed. Because if you don't produce something somebody wants, all you can do is offer it to them. You can't force them to buy it. Well, if you can, if you're the government, you got guns, okay, right? But if you don't have guns, then how do you get somebody to buy what you're selling? You got to be good, and you got to be competing on some level that's not just price. Because if you're competing on just price, you got nothing. You're just a mimic. Now, competing on price is good. Consumers are benefited from that. They get more stuff for less money, and that's all part of the process as well. But it is truly it's the commoditization of objects through time, the natural depreciation of a thing whatever widget was produced today, tomorrow will be worth less. What we call the law of diminishing marginal utility drives innovation, because how are we going to continue to be profitable? How are we going to continue to be better? We can't just rest on our laurels, because in order to attract people to our business, we have to become better. And it doesn't matter who we're talking about. It doesn't matter if we're McDonald's serving bad food, or we're political commentators, or psychological commentators. We have to be constantly striving for a different truth, for a new truth, for something better, in order to help the people that we're serving better understand the world. Because all of this is just a big search for truth and search for value, in order to alleviate stress, in order to alleviate anxiety, and then go from there. Now, of course, it's a cyclic process, and we're kind of at that moment in time where we've kind of almost reached our Wall-E moment, right? You know, Wall-E, the world in Wall-E, where they're all just kind of sitting around. They're the perfect consumers, right? Like they don't even they can't get out of the chair. They're right. So that world is where they're pushing us towards, and the robots will do everything, right? Yeah. And the whole Venus project, crazy stuff. It's all nonsense. But unfortunately, the people who run the world, or the people who think they run the world, I call them the people who think they run the world. They're actively about ready to reset all of us into this worldview that they have, and it's going to be very, very ugly, and it's going to be chaotic, and it's not going to work. And they're as nuts as Hitler was, if not more so, because they have bigger ambitions, unfortunately.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
Is the call still recording?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I just wanted to double check because it was on my screen. It popped off. So
I haven't turned it off yet. No, we're good. No, yeah, no, I wouldn't have turned that off. That's like the essence of this conversation.
I was psyching out the audience there, just trying to keep them on their edge, keep them on their toes. Make sure.
No worries. I can always edit it out. If not, I usually don't. I usually just let the whole thing run. So
nice. We'll have the blip then. Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to talk about in regards to what you brought up, because some of them were like brilliant framing. For example, that idea, like Steve Jobs is just a great example. He is someone who creates something beautiful and eloquent. And what is interesting is that it works. And this speaks to us and says, wait a second, this whole fucking idea that we're running around with bernays, where like everybody's just this walking stomach with like a dick, is actually is actually like wrong, in that like there is. You can call out of them something better. You can call out of them something higher. Like you can present them something more beautiful, and they'll actually go for it. And we don't know the upper limits to that. Actually, we don't know the upper limits to that, but we do know that it goes very, very, very high. Now this becomes extremely problematic, because we look at the way the world has gone, and it's definitely not been orchestrated that way. Profit has, in the end, I sound like such a leftist, man. Profit is in the end just ground away at the potential for people to present things that are beautiful. Sadly, just the sheer majority is probably just eventually going to sink, and people like Steve Jobs will be the rare occasion and not necessarily the rule. But that doesn't mean that people like Steve Jobs won't make it through. And this is an interesting thing, because you wonder, is that a consequence of just human nature, or is it possible actually to make this game more redemptive? And
it is. It's very possible, and I'll tell you how. Because I see it all the time. It's actually very good. Where we get lost in the discussion about profit, and we live in an age where the Marxist leftist mentality that profit is exploitation is the problem. They have conditioned people to believe that profit is exploitation, and it is not. It's actually the exact opposite of that. This is the problem. I'm very sensitive to the word profit, because when we actually, and for this reason and this reason alone, that profit is your reward for serving your customer. Because here's the gig, right? I'm pants at making shoes, dude. I'm really good at talking about politics. So I can talk about politics, and I can get paid for it. And I can use my time very effectively to talk about politics, and then go buy shoes from somebody else who's so much better at making shoes than I am. It's called comparative advantage. And profit is a mutually beneficial situation, because if we weren't both willing to see value, and this gets back to this concept of value that you brought up at the beginning, that value is in the eye of the beholder, and that libertarians and or Austrian economists believe fundamentally there is no objective value in the universe. There's only subjective value when it comes down to man acting, right? Even gold doesn't have objective value. It has no counterparty risk, but it doesn't have objective value. It has subjective value, and that subjective value rises and falls on the open market. The subjectivity of value is what creates the potential for win-wins. We're having a conversation today because, and I say this all the time as well, we're having this conversation today because, and we could be doing anything else in the world other than this, right? We have all these other options for spending our hour or however long we're going to spend chatting with each other. We could do anything else in the world, anything, and we chose to do this. Why? Because we felt that there would be some kind of profit on both ends, that we're both going to learn something, and that this is the most valuable use of our time, right? And I firmly believe that, which is why I asked you to come on the show today. But it doesn't matter what that definition of profit is, right? And how that profit takes form. What we've done through the imposition of an entire class of literal robber barons is to interject themselves and suck away the value of that other people create for themselves, and then use that and deploy that against us. And then they issue stock and call that profit for their companies, when their companies have no business existing in the real world. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, heretofore Microsoft. I can go on and on and on and on. Those kinds of this is even to a lesser extent McDonald's. So this is the thing. This is the conversation I wanted to have with you, to find that cross linkage between the definition of the word profit and value. And I think this is for me. So what do you think about all that?
Absolutely, and I think I guess in order to frame the conversation, because I'm more interested in framing this stuff, because again, I just don't know enough about the modern side of things like this, but I do like to talk about history in this type of context. And this is sort of what I was building up to, because you spoke about the robber barons, and I think maybe we can have a bit of a conversation about these gentlemen for a while.
Sure.
So all these ideas of what a man is, it's in some sense it's a blunderous mistake, in that we, as a collective, we choose to support these mutual delusions that man is merely yeast clinging to a rock, and it leads us to constructing our own prison around us, and this, all these bad things happen, and we're certainly to blame. But on the flip side, there is a factor of it where there's those at the top have an unequal their vote counts a lot more than the rest of us, let's put it this way. And this is the sort of dark side of things, is that it's actually quite suitable to view the world as it's quite useful to view people this way, if you have a certain system in place, because it becomes extremely easy to extract vast amount of resources out of them. Now, when I look into money, and money is a very hard thing to understand, I look into the history of like banking and how it works with wars. And especially like the English central bank, and how they were so effective at fighting wars in Europe. And for example, Napoleon is a great one. And what I find so fascinating about it is how money was the ability to create vast sums of money that were detached from actual real world value. So this is a sort of like how credit comes in, and was almost like this magical power, because it was like this ability to just create a balloon of will out of nothing, and then have the British people pay it off for like 300 years. So it was almost like you're betting with history in this amazing way. And it's actually incredible. Like when I look into that, I know you're supposed to look at that and be like, that's awful, evil, and bad. And in some sense, I think it is. But my God, it's so smart. It's so smart as well, and it worked. Like the British were a world-conquering set of badasses. Like there's no denying it. I really admire what they pulled off, despite the fact they fucking enslaved us. But it was great, and it I think one of the key things was that ability to just wield, out of like this, they could click their hands together and suddenly they could have this big magic number, and then they could give all these numbers to people, and then people would give them their will, their labor, basically. And this is what was so fascinating about it, is that the key value was being able to get a soldier to shoot or fight or do something for you, or a propagandist to write something for you, or media to do something to you. So the money was a means towards getting the spirit of the man to work for you. That was the key. The money was the key to moving the man to being part of your force, part of your company. And so the British Empire, or the British Army, was this massive company that they were running, and this magical money that that was imposed in a sort of debt loop. That was the big system that was going on there. Now that's absolutely fascinating, and that's absolutely the way that modern societies are run. Like the American government basically runs on the exact same idea. Like the reason why, like, everybody in America is going to be paying off the debt for American hegemony for 100 years after America are no longer hegemonists, like that type of thing, unless there's a debt jubilee coming up anytime soon.
Or even exist.
Yeah,
I mean, seriously, or after America doesn't exist anymore. And the Great Reset that's coming in Europe. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating, because that's like almost like magic. You can make something out of
absolutely
nothing.
Magic. It is magic. It is what central bankers do. Is they produce tomorrow's money to buy today's goods at yesterday's prices.
Yes. Okay. And that's actually that's fascinating.
And that time shift is the essence of the magic that they. I hesitate to call it, because it's fucking evil. It is truly the source of so much evil, because what it does is it exacerbates the tendency of us to indulge our psychosis, all the bad aspects of our personalities. I mean, right, Jung talks about integrating the shadow, and we have our shadow, and we have to deal with that. There are some people who love their shadow, and they're like, and they go and they exercise it all day long. They're consumed by it, and they see the opportunity to utilize it, and to its greatest extent. And the biggest problem, but this is where we libertarians come in, is like, look, the only thing worse than child abuse is the institutionalization of it thereof. Right? The only thing worse than blah is institutionalizing it, giving other humans guns and pointing them at other humans and saying, you have to do it this way. Right? It's one thing when everybody is able to point a gun at each other. And it's another thing when one group gets to put on a badge and a uniform, and they can shoot without bearing the consequences of it. Right? And I don't think human beings are good or bad. Right? I think they are what they are. They're a mix of good and bad. Sometimes they're brilliant. Sometimes they're pathetic. Sometimes they're downright evil. But if you give them the opportunity to shirk a responsibility and to be able to take responsibility for something without consequence, and take control of something that's not theirs, they will do it almost every time. It takes a strong person to resist that process over and over and over again. Even just because you know it's wrong. This is part of the reason why Christianity was so powerful, because it has tried to, and most religions honestly try to create a framework of rules to say, no, don't do that. That is wrong. And it's wrong because it will have long-term consequences that you can't see beyond just grabbing for the brass ring today. It's like Gandalf says in The Lord of the Rings, right? When Frodo offers him the ring, he says, no, I would use this ring with the desire to do good, and through me it would do a terrible evil. So this is all playing out everywhere. And the whole thing about the monetary system is that you cannot corrupt money that way. And we've never been able to hold money to that higher standard. I don't know that we can, but we need to be aware of it. The point is ultimately that if we are aware of the problem, then we can guard against it as much as possible.
And that's what I think is so interesting about this, is that it's almost like the forbidden fruit, in the sense of that, like, when you take it, it fucking works like a charm. But it is like it sets you on a path. It's like, the the Faustian deal. You're kind of you're gonna keep kicking the stone down the road, but it's actually like picking up dirt. And actually, if you're the guy rolling the stone, you're probably going to be in pretty good position as well. And it forces, I think, it boxes the people who are operating this, and because they were the ones who like won out of history, it also boxes them into seeing man in a certain way. Like I think this encourages them to see man as that stomach that's jotting around, and that's all well and good. And I what I find so fascinating about this is how people are so unconscious of the fact that this is not necessarily how things have to operate. That's what I find fascinating about it. And again, it's tied to that idea of people are just so incapable of seeing the nature of man is not to be the comfort orientated, like soft boundaried last man, the yeast of life. And what I see with that is, I guess the juxtaposition I noticed is by learning about how Catholicism actually worked, and specifically how cathedrals worked. Cathedrals are always a very interesting thing to me. You hear some really, really random things throughout history that kind of make you scratch your nose. I paid my tax there at the end of October. So that's the tax time in Ireland, right? And it always sucks. Like, it always sucks to pay tax. That's one thing that's not nice. And I remember I was listening to this thing about Rome, and when you do something that sucks and it's like in your nervous system, you're sort of like, oh, fucking tax. You kind of your ears perk up when tax comes up. And apparently at the start of the Roman Empire, they only paid like 5 days worth of tax. That was the entirety of how much they paid. They had an incredibly low amount of tax at the start, and obviously later on it became a horrific bureaucracy and then collapsed. And the same was actually, it was sort of similar in medieval Catholicism. Now, this is a very, very interesting thing, because the medieval Catholic people who were living around there, like, they're obviously like, oh, they're all oppressed by the tyrannical church. But at the same time, these people worked 8 weeks a year, obviously harvest and planting. And the rest of the weeks of the year, they literally had fuck all to do. It was all holidays. So they had basically 40 weeks of nothing. And so what they used to do is they used to just volunteer for projects. And those projects were usually, well, what we all like, Christianity, so we'll go build a church. Right. And so the reason why Europe is essentially heaven on earth, like it is one of the most beautiful places in the world, like, without comparison, is because of this system, specifically this system, where the Catholic priests were, and maybe the Protestants as well. I'm not saying it was exclusive to Catholics, but this sort of mindset, of the sort of agrarian, you do your little bit of work, and then all that free time you're going to devote it towards creating something exceptionally beautiful. And this is like, the cathedral in England and all that stuff going around. Like, France is just amazing. Italy is just incomprehensible. And the church sort of operated as this thing that would do this. And what you can compare, you can juxtapose this with it's a different type of magic, because these priests, this institution, this church was able to wield the spirit of millions of Europeans and magically get them to produce things of incalculable value. Value that is just stretches out till 1,000 years after it was made. This is what these churches are, the Sistine Chapel, all this type of thing. And the sort of thesis of the Catholic Church is absolutely fascinating, because it actually is juxtaposed directly against the more magic money attitude. Now, both of them are sort of magic. They're both sort of styles of magic, if you will. But one of them is more conscious or more focused on centering the source of value on the human creative spirit and thinking to itself, if I free these people up as much as possible, so they do all their work, and if I free them up and lift their spirits enough with this idea of Christ and the human spirit is valuable and all this type of stuff, if I free these people enough, I will be able to get out of them something beautiful that they will actually get inspired by. It's like what you were saying with Steve Jobs, and their spirit will lift, and it'll be an upward spiral, and suddenly we'll be living in Catholic Europe with all this beautiful cathedrals and all that. And that thesis was a very smart thesis that definitely worked on some level. That's worth considering. Now, this is juxtaposed because the Catholics banned, for example, they would have called it usury back then, which is essentially interest-based loans, which is, in some sense, the credit loans that the magic money makers in England and France and Sweden and all that, and Holland started to figure out when we started making modern markets and all that. Now, there's a very, very interesting critique you can levy towards the magic money makers. I don't think they're going to care that if I say this or not, but nonetheless, you can sort of point out to it. It's that, like, these these guys haven't pulled off any cathedrals. There's, if anything, the consequences of this game, this perception of man, and this system that has been put into place has been very de-spiriting and demoralizing and tragic, and it renders you in a slum. It renders you in a
well, look at modern architecture. Modern architecture
exactly
is sterile. Yeah, that's exactly the point you're leading up to. Modern architecture is horrible. It's horrific. I remember, I haven't been to Europe, but I grew up in New York, and we used to go into the city on a regular basis. And I remember going to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York for the first time. And yeah, it's stunning. I mean, it's just stunning, and it's awe-inspiring. I was raised Catholic. I'm kind of recovering Catholic, is the way I would put it today. And plenty of spirituality, just not particularly Catholic, right? So my mom was a failed nun. She ran away from home to join the nunnery, and that didn't work. So she became a nurse and married my dad, had 4 kids, and there's that, right? An incredibly Catholic household, but I remember going into St. Patrick's. I think I took Camille there when I took her to the city. The one time she came up to visit my parents, and we just stood. You just stand there in stunned silence at the beauty of it, right? And nothing like, even the difference between new Yankee Stadium and old Yankee Stadium. Like, there's a big difference between the old ballpark and the one that's the house that Steinbrenner built. And just like, I was growing up a Yankees fan. I'm not a particularly baseball fan either, but I just think about it now and how important baseball was to the culture in my house and everything else just popping into my head. Like, these things are different, right? These things had character, and they don't today. The men who are making money off of money and doing what they're doing today, they're exercising the soul from everything, and I think they're doing it on purpose. I really do. I think it's a very purposeful thing. I think these people are all Marxists, and I think they're trying to build a new Soviet man, and I think that's where we're headed. And I think this is all, it's hard for me to argue otherwise when I look at what's happening, and I see us being downstream of Comintern and all the long march to the institutions and all of this stuff today. I just look at it and I'm like, this wasn't an accident. I mean, it's also part of it. It's not been directed, but it's certainly been, we know that what happens if you set these systems like this in motion, right? Yeah. We know what the cycle of history looks like. And then lop on top of it the new dominant political philosophy of the age, which is not free market capitalism. It's Marxism. Yeah. But living in a world of immense energy density, the harnessing of oil and the harnessing of the law in terms of the codification of property rights, I think are two very powerful things. And they've been fighting the forces of progress, have been fighting the forces of, frankly, regress. And we have created such wealth, relatively speaking, and such comfort that now it can be kind of turned against us in a very vicious and envious way. And I use the phrase all the time that Marxism has an unquenchable sense of envy for something, because they're soulless. They've lost their soul. Yep.
So. And it's a tough question, because you're like, are the robber barons the fucking Illuminati, and are they like, has this been the game? And
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about that, but I do know that
it comes to a point where I think you have to sort of just ask it and be like, hey, like, maybe it is, dude. Maybe they're reptiles.
It depends on. Catch me on Tuesday, and I'll give you a different answer, right? Like, I can put on my Alex Jones hat, and I'll tell you right now that if you're ever going to build a tinfoil hat, always Reynolds heavy duty and nothing else. Don't use no cheap substitutes, man. Don't be a tourist. Build a proper tinfoil hat, and only the best conspiracy theorists use Reynolds heavy duty. So, but
100%, man, 100%. But like, there's one angle you can look at that, but I think that gives an awful lot of agency to these people, like godlike agency, where they can actually like turn the cogs of history.
Right.
Now, I think there's definitely an interesting argument about the idea that it's the forbidden fruit, and as you said, once someone starts to use modern financial credit systems, it creates a bubble that can last for 400 years. Like it can be actually that big of a bubble, you know. Like the Catholic attitude, or maybe we'll say the pre-modern attitude towards value was that you didn't ever base money or anything like that off anything abstract like that. It was always focused on the creative individual, lifting the spirit of the individual. That's the source of creativity. Nice. It was almost like they were trying to consolidate the Christian man, or the church going man, as the spirit that will derive. Like he's like the piece of gold. It's very.
He's your store of value. He's your unit of account, as it were, in monetary terms. Yeah, no, that's that's a great insight.
And it's very, very interesting as well, because if you think about what that means, it means that like the absolute focus of your society is on getting the most, like filling that person with the most of their highest spirit, you know. Mm-hmm. And the Catholics were far from perfect, but fucking hell, they got that right. And you have to sit down with that, and like you have to stare at that seriously and be like, there's something there that the results speak for themselves. As Jesus would say, judge the tree by its fruit. And you know, as I said, like Europe is incredible what it pulled off. And
go ahead.
Well, okay. And so there's that sort of side, and you can sort of suggest then what happened is in the competition during colonialism, where they were, you know, they had to credit a ship to go off and conquer El Dorado and then come back with all that type of stuff. This is when finance started to slip in, and then they started to get savvy with this stuff, and then they started to make big bets with this stuff, and then they started to kind of say, holy shit, like we can all do all this account jostling and write it off the books, and get away with like having millions more pounds than we had in millions of more, like as we said, the magic money thing, you know. And then suddenly you're like wielding an army and getting like your great grandson to pay it off and stuff like this. And this all leads to a question of like, is that a historical process that was set in motion? And then there's the last one, and I think this is probably the most accurate one, is that it was a historical process set in motion. I think certain people did bite the forbidden fruit, and the fact of the matter is that because it works, the people who bit the fruit ended up winning, and the people who didn't bite the fruit ended up losing. And that's the reason why we're in the position we're in now, which is actually horrifically depressing and disempowering. Yes, because it's like entropy. That's literally what it sounds like. It's like these people are just riding a wave of entropy, and they're sort of sitting there and just being like, well, look, it is what it is. Like, I'd love to be the good, nice, moral guy and do it a different way, but a different way wouldn't work. Some other fuck would come along and do, credit-free, usury or something like that, and get a bigger army and crush me, and that would be the end of that. And so you have a lot of problems and questions, and I think it's where a lot of this stuff comes full circle, because this force of entropy, this tide that is going on now, is so similar to that paradigm Nietzsche noticed about the last man. It's all tied up into this form of magic, which is this money magic that's going on, and the sort of laissez-faire, debt-based capitalism or something like that, interest-based capitalism.
I would argue it's actually not even capitalism. It's actually a very pernicious form of socialism. It's actually just corporatism. It is the merging of state and free markets in this third way that's actually the most dangerous. See, full-on collectivism doesn't work. We know what that looks like. It looks like East Germany. Okay, we know what that looks like. It looks like East Germany, it looks like North Korea. We don't have real markets. There is no bidding for anything. The state controls everything. Then you have the opposite end of that, which is that the laissez-faire, which is the argument. It's the laissez-faire capitalism or anarcho-capitalism, which we never really see exist. We only see the reflection of it in the greatness of projects that exist all around us today, and all of the fruits of our own labor. That, as great as the world is today, imagine how much better it would be if all these freaking people weren't trying to steal it all from us and misdirect all the capital. And then you have what we have, which is this third way, where the government and the corporations that are supportive of it, and they're supportive of each other in a circle jerk, right? There's not really much of a of a difference between them. I hesitate to call what we have today capitalism and all. It's much closer to fascism, to the classic Mussolini definition of fascism. Nothing outside the state, everything within the state, with private property in name only. And the individual having been destroyed. And what we've done is we've destroyed law, and we've destroyed the ability of a person to get redress of grievance through the courts, and which they may or may not ever have had. But we had something very special here in the United States called the Constitution, which isn't a perfect document. It's not even close to that. But it's the first really strong organizing document to say that we, the people, grant power to government, and the government is subordinate to us. Okay, and that it's a recitation of only positive powers. It's a negative document. The government is only allowed to do this, and this, and by inference, it's not allowed to do any of this other stuff. Oops, we don't do that anymore. And then we're in this very weird state, and all of the things that we're talking about are all cyclic, right? And they all follow the business cycle, and more importantly, they all follow the freaking solar cycles and everything else, and the weather cycles, which is another freaky discussion for a different day. But they're all tied to each other, and we're dealing with the end of a 300-year period where the sun's been pumping out so much energy that food's cheap, frankly. And that's part of the reason why everything is relatively so easy, because we've got bountiful harvests of wheat and corn that we've never been able to produce in our history, and we can do so through the harnessing of oil and energy density and the stored energy of billions of years of life on this planet, right? So, and we can tap into a small portion of that and create what we've created, and lift billions of people out of poverty. Right? We've lifted billions of people out of poverty in the 20th century, in the early 21st century. Billions. Right? Yeah. We couldn't feed 1 billion people in 1900. Today, we can feed 7 billion. And there's very few people living in abject poverty today, relatively speaking. I mean, there's still plenty of them. But look at the number that we've lifted out of poverty. We have a population of over 7 billion people. And, okay, let's call it 1 billion people live in abject poverty. Well, we're still feeding 6 billion. The Malthusians never thought we could feed 1 billion. And they want to collapse us back to 1 billion. So I know I'm kind of rambling here a little bit, but the point being is that this system has created all of this wealth, even though it's as imperfect and as honestly as corrupt and trending towards maximal corruption as it is. And I think that one of the things that I know that you're working on with the people that you talk to on a regular basis on your channel, that you talk about the potential for a new era, a new ion in Jungian terms and whatnot. And I think I want you to talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to cap this one off, and maybe we'll do another one of these in the future or whatever. But I think this is an important thing, because we've talked about a lot of dark stuff today, and because I firmly believe that we're reaching a peak of this kind of cultural collapse, this kind of peak cultural war and everything, and we have to hit rock bottom in order for us to then become brave and go thou forth and find the next version of humanity.
Certainly. I think we've laid the groundwork for a lot of what I'd say that is, because there was a period back in time where the Catholics had a sort of, they had the correct economic view, organized society, and that's definitely a heretical thing. And I know I get in a lot of trouble for saying that, but they centered their focus. You phased out there for just a second. Can you say that again, please? Oh, thank God. Okay, sweet. So I basically said, let's run with for the sake of the argument, let's run with the idea that what the Catholics achieved, or we'll say the Christians more generally, achieved through their centering of the source of value being the human spirit within the community, which the entire institutional society was focused on lifting up to its highest cultural form. Right. That was the, and that's not necessarily exactly what happened, but let's just assume that this is what they're trying to do.
Sure.
And this was sort of right, or at the very least, that was better than what we have, or it's the sort of shadow of what we have in some sense, because what we see now instead is a dynamic opposite to that. We have ridiculously jargonized fake nonsense money that is is weighed. It is, and the way the Catholics got your spirit to build their cathedral is that they would, in some sense, well, socially pressure you, I'm sure, but in another sense, like you sort of wanted to. You had enough free time that you could offer it up. You could be a cranky bastard if you wanted to.
Sure.
But on top of that, it was like you're offered to build something great and build something eternal, build something everlasting, and that actually would get people to participate in that. Like people want to do stuff like that. This is how they could set building projects that would last generations, is because people want to build something that lasts generations. Right. People want to be participating in these type of things. And instead, the juxtaposition of today's world is that instead of, persuading people in that way towards something higher, that you'll build something that lasts forever, it's that you essentially have to bribe them, or even worse, you have to pressure them by like putting them in debt via birth. And then, wrapping them up and like taking 50 weeks of their year and 60 hours a week, living inside, stressed out of their mind, loaded up on pills, attached with all these like various mortgages and loans that are just slowly eeping out their life essence from them. Yep. And this is a different vision of man. Man is in some sense, I shouldn't even say man. Man is in fact a woman that is to be like raped and exploited, that type of thing. It starts to look an awful lot more like that, which is quite a tragic thing, and it's very, very depressing, because the sort of conclusion of our ion, I think we're reaching, in some sense, you kind of hope we're reaching the apex of this energy. We're finally coming to the end of this view, but that's not necessarily a good thing. That means things are going to be crazy. And the apex of this view is the centering of that man as the consumer who consumes the world and is a sort of like battery, or a battery hen for all these other forces, the barons, if you will, that we don't really understand too well. And what it kind of leads to is a kind of question of it's almost like logic, like once you reach one extreme, you can't go any more extreme, and so the only movement is in the different direction, or it's a flipping of the paradigm, it's a inversion of the paradigm, it's a changing of the perspective entirely, a paradigm shift. And I would suggest that in the current context of our the technology we have now and the possibilities that we have now, it wouldn't be out of this world, because the reason it wouldn't be out of this world that we could revert back to something based on those psychological principles that you saw in Christianity. Now, this would be the most radical revolution you would see in the last 200 years, perhaps, maybe since Napoleon himself. This would be such a huge deal, because so many things would have to change. Descartes, the Cartesian mindset, which is the foundation for the Western understanding of the mind, would have to get flipped over. That would have to give way to something closer to Freudianism or Jungianism. And there's plenty of scientific evidence to back some of that stuff up now, to this idea that we have more potential in our mind, that we're not rational decision makers. The marketers already know that, for example. And that would then consequentially lead to a revolution in science, revolution in philosophy, and that would lead to the most significant political revolution you could ever imagine, because the entire premise of democracy is that we are rational individuals and we make choices. And if you run with the idea that we have a unconscious spirit that is where the source of value is, and the only rational moral goal is that we work on lifting that spirit out of ourselves so that it become creative, and so that we can all start to flow that into the society to create something beautiful like the cathedrals of old. That is the complete juxtaposition to the way that modern democracy works. Modern democracy works that you have to go out and be informed and then make a decision on the nature of the world. That just is not compatible with these two things. But I think if you started to and you know what's even more interesting is what's coming up with all these plans after COVID is that there's this decision to create a new human being. That's coming. And so it seems like, if I was to put my Jungian lens on, it seems like the archetype is here. It seems like the vision of man is now going to be decided. And it might just be one of those little windows of history, you would hope, where you get to it gets to be a little bit chaotic, and that vision of man can be wrestled from various camps, and the vision of man that will probably do us the best service hopefully will win. Let's put it this way.
Let's put it that way. I would hope. Yeah.
I would propose it's the one I'm proposing. We'll see what happens.
And that's fascinating. As I was listening to that, I'm like, I keep getting reminded. Ideas keep popping through my head all the time as I go through this. And it's something that Ron Paul used to say when he was on the campaign trail. He said, look, he doesn't say here's the deal, because he's saying Joe Biden. He said, look, tyranny is an old idea. It's as old as humanity. We've always lived under some form of tyranny. Liberty is a very young idea. The individual as the guiding unit of society is a very young concept. We haven't really had many years. We've always we've been at times in the past, more individualist and taxalist or whatever. But just the codification of the ideas inherent in this are very young, and the way I look at it is that, and I've been looking at it for a long time, is to say, look, we're going to explore all facets of Marxism until it fails, because that's what we do as a species. We've decided that this is something we need to integrate into our tool set, philosophical tool set, whatever you want to call it, the DNA, the collective unconscious, whatever metaphor you like. And we're going to run that until we get to the end of it. And then that's going to blow up in our face, and then we're going to pick something else, and we're going to run with that one as the next dominant idea. And hopefully it's a damn sight better than that. And I hope that it's a damn sight better than this kind of soft tyranny that Marx proposed, the earliest versions of a systematic way of getting rid of the coercive, tyrannical state. Right? Yeah. That was what he was attempting to do, and I give him props for that. I don't agree with how we were going to get there, but hey, I can give him props for that, and I can see why, from that perspective, it's very what's the word I'm looking for? It's very attractive, certainly to the people who are on the ass end of the magic money tree, right? Yeah. Or who get the money last. Yeah. And I get that. I understand it completely. And I joke with a friend of mine all the time. I said, we grew up in Mexico, we'd all be raving leftists. We'd sound no different than Che Guevara. Like, yeah. But we didn't. We grew up in the United States, where we had a lot more opportunity to think these things through in a lot different time horizons. So I really do appreciate you coming on today. I really do. And I appreciate the work that you're doing on your channel and with the other people that you're working with. I think it's incredibly fascinating what you guys are what you're doing and what you're trying to find in all of your conversations that I hear you have with other people, trying to find that next thing that's going to be there for us as a species, because I think it's important. It's like the most important job there is, and it sounds to me like it's a calling. And
we'll see.
Hey man, we all get it at some. Hopefully, we all get it at some point. And I'll bring up the last thing I'll say on my way out the door, which is this: Gary North. I'll bring up that old Calvinist Gary North again. He said, if you're lucky in this life, you can figure out a way to monetize your calling. Most of us have jobs. Yeah, and if you're lucky and you can make that work, then you can change the world.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. So. Yeah, it's true, man. It's true. Yeah. It's true. Well, thank you very much. It's an absolute privilege to have it on. Like, this is, as I said, it's a little bit outside of my sort of normal channels, but it's something that I actually love doing a bit of a brush on, because there's a lot of these things, because the human mind and the human spirit is the source of, it's the thing we bring to everything, and it becomes a factor in everything. And Absolutely. So it's always very interesting to see how these things unfold themselves in these various realms. So thank you very much for having me on and taking me for this walk. And sir, it was good. It was a good chat. I certainly learned a few things, and let's see how it goes. Let's see if this is the one that sparks the revolution.
I wouldn't say no to that. Let's just put it that way. All right. You have a great day. My friend, and we'll talk soon.
And good luck, you and Mary Boyos over there, you Yanks. I hope everything goes well. I know it might be a bit crazy for a while, so stay safe, stay home, and good luck.
Or go out in the streets and let everybody know that you're just not going to take it anymore. Well, one or the other. We may have to do that, and if we do, well, then it's time to be brave, and that's what we'll do.
It's true.
All right. Thank you, sir. Take care now.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Well, that about wraps it up for this episode of the Gold Goats and Guns podcast. I'll be back next Tuesday with another one. I'm not sure who I'm going to interview or what I'm going to talk about because, well, I don't operate that way. We will have some possible resolution on the election, and as today goes along, it's going to get very interesting. So you guys take care. You be well. We'll talk in a week. Keep your stick on the ice.